Now if you notice, there are a lot of figures here, but you basically, before you get overwhelmed, start at some point again, right? And then you move from there. So let's go through the general overview here. Okay, so with the arteries, with the arterial supply, it's usually pretty much the same for humans, okay? It's the veins that sometimes differ or vary among individuals, okay? Now, I mentioned also last time that if you know the names of the arteries, more often than not, the traveling veins together with the ones that are traveling together with them would also be named the same, okay? All right, so you start with, do you remember this part? The ascending aorta, and then the arch of the aorta, and then you have the descending aorta. And then you have three branches, right?
Yeah.
You have the, this is your brachiocephalic trunk, and this will bifurcate into your right common carotid, and then your right subclavian artery, right? And then here you have a direct branch of the left common carotid and the left subclavian artery, okay? If you notice, the common carotid will bifurcate into two. You're going to have the internal carotid and the external carotid. The internal carotid will basically supply the brain and branch out to supply all of the brain parts. And then the external will be more on the face and the outside part, okay? So same thing with the right. And then you're going to have what you call the basilar artery, okay? And you'll see more of that in detail on here. So it's basically showing you, especially since up here, you're going to need, remember how in the heart you had connections of the different veins, different arteries, to make sure that the myocardium is very well supplied, especially so with the brain, because the brain requires blood 24/7, right, in adequate amounts. And so you're going to see connections between the arteries, okay? So when you look at that, you want to use this figure right here and try to trace, okay? Now, if you follow the subclavian, okay, it's going to go down and it's going to change its name. Remember how we mentioned that when these, kind of like the aorta, it changed its name, right? So from the arch of the aorta to the descending to the, then it's going to be the thoracic and then the abdominal. So it's bound to change its name. Now, as for your brachiocephalic trunk, we mentioned that those bifurcated, right, into the right subclavian and the right common carotid. So here you're going to see this is the right subclavian and this is your left subclavian. So on here, as soon as it passes your shoulder area, it's now going to be called your axillary artery, okay, and then eventually it will bifurcate into your ulnar and your radial artery. And if you remember which one's more lateral, it should be easy, right? Which one's more lateral? The radial artery, okay? So this would be your radial artery and this would be your ulnar artery, okay? Now if you follow the descending artery and then the thoracic, and remember the levels from T5 through T12 will be the demarcations for your thoracic artery. And then basically you're going to have direct branches, okay? So your celiac trunk, okay, which will basically supply abdominal or visceral organs, okay? And then you also have your renal, so you have those there. And then you're going to have the mesenteric, and those are going to be branched off, okay? So again, you have, this book is pretty good in showing you the details on that. So on this figure right here, okay, so you can trace that, all right? Now on the very bottom, so as it goes down, you're going to have the abdominal aorta, okay, that will bifurcate into your common iliac arteries. Remember how up here it was the common carotids? Okay, those are the sole suppliers of blood to your brain. This time for the lower extremities, it will depend on these two. So you have the common iliac arteries. And it should sound familiar because you remember the iliac bone, so as it passes alongside there. And then you're going to note that it also bifurcates. So each one, so you're going to have the right common iliac and then the left common iliac. Each one will subdivide or bifurcate into two more. Remember how you had the internal carotid and the external carotid? Same thing here. You're going to have the internal iliac and then the external iliac artery. So you're going to have one on the right and then one on the left. Okay? And then as it passes, remember how up here, as it passed a certain point, it became the axillary artery. Here, you're going to pass a certain point, and the it's going to become the femoral artery. Okay, so your external iliac artery will eventually become the femoral artery, and you're also going to have a deep branch, which is the deep femoral artery. Okay, and then you're going to have the internal iliac artery, which basically supplies the pelvic area. Okay? And then as you trace down, you're going to further see subdivisions. So remember the popliteal artery that you could palpate in the popliteum, okay, or the popliteus. And then you're going to have the posterior tibial, and then you're going to have your anterior tibial as well as the fibular. And then you're going to see the dorsalis pedis artery, okay, the one that you can palpate here. Okay? And then you're also going to have the plantar arch, which is going to be in the bottom. So that's the basic skeleton of your arterial system. As for the venous, as I mentioned, if you know the names of these ones, it's pretty much going to be the same. But this time, remember the flow is going to be the opposite way. So if you want to trace it the opposite way, that will probably be best, okay? So then you start from the periphery, and then you go back to the heart. You're going to trace it back to the heart because you know that the veins visit the heart, right? So that's the direction that they should go.
Does that have to do with the oxygen, right?
This is going to be the oxygen port, mostly, with the exception, remember, of the pulmonary vessels, right? Okay. So you can start here from the digits, and then you have the palmar venous arch, and then it goes up. You have the ulnar vein, the radial vein, and then you also have the median cubital vein. And again, this is the one that can vary from person to person. Okay, you have the cephalic vein, the basilic vein, and then you're going to have them drain up to your axillary vein, and then you have the subclavian vein. So if you trace it as they travel together with your artery, it's going to have the same name. Okay, so you have except for this one, you're not going to have the carotid vein. It's the jugulars, but you're going to have the internal jugular and the external jugular veins. Okay. And then you have the vertebral vein, which travels together with your vertebral artery. Now here, when you go from the bottom, so you're also going to have the plantar venous arch and the dorsal venous arch, and then you're going to have your popliteal vein, and you're going to have a small saphenous and a great saphenous vein. Usually the great saphenous vein is, you know how when they do a bypass, what they basically do is go, because there's a block usually in the artery, one of the coronary arteries. So what they do is they use the great saphenous vein usually to connect that's why they bypass the block. That's why it's called a coronary bypass. Okay, so from the proximal end to the distal end, they make that connection using the saphenous vein. Okay, and then you travel up, so you have the saphenous, and then you have the femoral vein, and then it basically the tributaries to your, when you say tributaries, it's basically draining into, okay? So then you have, do you remember the name of this one, the artery? The ones that, no, after,
Not the muscle, but the what's next to the muscle.
sounds like the bone, iliac, right? So you have the internal iliac and the external iliac. So you're also going to have the internal iliac vein and the external iliac vein. And then you're going to have the common iliac vein, and then those will basically drain into your inferior vena cava. And then you have the renal veins here, and then those will also drain into the inferior vena cava, and the inferior vena cava, if you remember, will drain into the right atrium. On the posterior side, inferior, as opposed to the jugulars and the subclavian and basically those will branch into or drain into the superior vena cava. Okay, eventually it will get there, and then it will land in your right atrium. Okay, and then it's gonna go another circuit. Does that make sense? All right. So spend some time. There are two of